on and then
go to the bathroom.
welcome, Bina. We're just going to wait a few minutes.
Thank you.
Will come.
Hi, Auntie B.
Hi, Sanj. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Nice to see you.
Hello,
Good to
friends.
see you
We're
too.
just waiting a few minutes here while people are coming on.
Glad to see you here.
Welcome, Allison and Bina. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. We have typically in these sessions of passages, people are coming a few minutes late, so we're just going to hang on just for a few minutes here. Here comes one more. I appreciate you all being here on the night when it is the World Series, not the Super Bowl, as I have recently learned. But I think, why don't we, shall we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If you're familiar with Quaker tradition, we might as well have just started with a moment of silence.
Moment of silence, exactly. So friends, I am welcome to those who are coming for the first time and to those who are joining us again. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this session of passages. So although each session of passages stands alone as a conversation, and some people come to one and some people come to all of them, the conversation topics are new, but there has been some flow to what we have discussed in past months. But I'd like to introduce you to and welcome Sanjay and Douglas, who are the leaders of our session here. And Sanjay and Douglas represent two different faith traditions that grew together as they grew together. Having grown up in families where their faith tradition was vibrantly a part of their lives on a daily and weekly basis, Douglas and Sanjay grew up knowing one another's traditions and actually being a part of one another's traditions. So in passages, what we aim to do is to create the space to talk about vulnerably and openly the ways in which we have been a part of a faith tradition and perhaps grown from our faith tradition. And in some cases, that might mean we have grown away from, we have had issues with our tradition. In some ways, perhaps it is deeply settled into our beings of who we are, although we have found points of disconnect as well. So we are grateful to have this space where we can talk in an interfaith and intergenerational way about the part that our traditions play in our lives and how we live our daily lives. So thank you, Douglas and Sanjay, for leading our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and setting the tone for our conversation here today. I'll add this to chat as we get new members to today's conversation again, but you should all see from me in the chat is sort of the questions to which we are going to speak on through today's session. This idea of community and what makes faith communities distinct, and why the question seems always to be, how do we get young people to go to church? How do we get young people to attend? Being such a pervasive one, it's identifiable that church communities want people to be able to find them. And I think that a good question to ask then, and one that we talked about a lot last week, was what do faith communities provide that people are seeking in the first place? Before I get too far into it, I would welcome everybody who is here to introduce themselves to our chat or on voice if you're comfortable with that. While I also allow Sanjay to introduce himself. I've talked long enough, right? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Sanjay Singh. I'm a Philadelphia native, but I live in DC now. And, you know, Auntie Meg really gave the summary there. I'm Douglas's best friend. That's my defining attribute. But like Auntie Meg said, Douglas and I grew up very closely sharing each other's faith traditions. I'd go to church, attend Sunday school with him. Douglas is a part of our religious rituals as well. And both of us were interested in big questions. Sorry about that. That's my dad. You know, we're interested in questions of. Give me a sec. Sorry about that. We were interested in questions of philosophy, and that naturally grew into questions about faith. You know, I come from a line of pandits, Indian priests, and Douglas, of course, comes from a line of priests as well. And I think along the way, we kind of realized that these religions have a lot in common, more in common than you think, and especially the most important things. And that's how we kind of jumped off into these alignment sessions. We realized that different faith backgrounds, they fundamentally try to answer questions about the human condition. You know, we've talked about grief, we've talked about community. Those are, I hate to say non-scientific, but they're more related to emotion, the human experience, than they are the actual nature of the universe. They're open-ended questions. They don't have absolute answers, and religion's one way people try to answer them. So I think this last session on community kind of gets to the core of a lot of those questions. Why do we have religion? What does it bring to our lives? And how do we convince other people it's meaningful?
So again, I would just say if everyone who is here would pop something into the chat about where you're coming from. Are you a part of a faith tradition? Have you been a part of a faith community? And maybe that can get us into talking about this sense of belonging or connectedness to our communities. So Karen is a seeker, wanderer, tree-hugging dirt worshiper. That's awesome.
You know, Ken, I always think that that's interesting. And I actually think a lot of the most profound religious teachers I know describe themselves in that way, as a seeker. And often, in my faith tradition, certainly, and others as well, I'm sure, I found that there's a large subset that wouldn't qualify themselves as seekers. They qualify themselves as people who know. They understand the nature of the religion. So I was wondering, Karen, you know, I think there's a tension. When you're seeking together, you might find different answers. Do you think that there is any tension, if any, between more of a dogmatic approach to religion, where there's truths and you believe them or you don't, and that makes you in the in group and the out group, or a more fluid technique where you're seeking out new answers and new truths?
It's a great question. I find that there is value in the tradition and the knowing and the ritualistic practice that comes from that knowing. But on the other hand, if there is not seeking and mysticism and discovering new edges of an ever expanding thing, then it puts whatever that greater being is, God, higher power, in a box. And I feel that a name or a description or a definition isn't appropriate for something that is creator of all, source of all.
That's an awesome answer. There's a part of, and I'm not going to remember which one at this point, but there's a part of one of the Upanishads that it talks about how there's people, wise men, who go round and round, relishing in the vanity of their learning, but the true enlightened person is the one who almost has no learning. They see the face of God everywhere. I've always thought that's really interesting. That idea in the Upanishads, the farther you get away with the scriptures, which are literally the next chapter in the Upanishads, they're literally the next chapters, the rituals. If the preface is, but don't take this too seriously. The true goal is to be able to see divinity in everything, in every relationship.
I think it's so interesting to hear you reflect on that from your religious practice, because of the passage I was reflecting on in preparation for today's session is astonishingly similar. It's this passage from Ezekiel, which describes, well, the passage I have here. What's the starting point? There we go. I lost my place. The passage reads, "Let us pray, gracious God. We are grateful for your word and seek to find the ways in which it is illuminated by your spirit to work and move among us today, that we might go from this place with greater understanding of your will, for as we walk through our daily lives in community with all your creation." For as we walk through our daily lives in community with all of your creation, it was the part of that passage that stuck with me the most, because it really does acknowledge that it is not about a singular piece of it. It's not about a singular location, a church, one community. It is all of creation containing facets of what we find worthy of worship in that one community. All of it condensed to one, spread out to all of it again. I think that, as this has been bumping around in my head for a little bit now, I just find it, once again, this type of conversation that we have had has led to, oh yeah, same for you, right? Same for me, same for you. Isn't that interesting? And I think also deeply reflective of the truth within those words. I'm seeing I'm a little behind on the chat, and for hey Allison, I'm Presbyterian too. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, I am very grateful to be able to reflect on that with you, but I think I've lost my train of thought. Apologies.
No, I
Thank you. Oh. Here, I can turn the video on.
Great. Hi.
This is my first one that I'm attending, and I have wanted to attend the previous one, so I'm thrilled that I'm able to be here and just be a part of the conversation. And while I was raised Presbyterian, I went to Catholic school most of my life, but also have very close friends that are Jewish. I worked at Jewish Family and Children's Service for many years, so I also have some beautiful daughters, and I want to kind of raise them to be aware that there are so many different faith communities and different religions, and to kind of learn and embrace all of them. So I'm really looking forward to tonight.
That's great. I think that what we want to kind of talk about too is how do we step into a faith community and feel a sense of belonging to it, if perhaps, and something we've talked about in weeks before, we might not completely agree with everything that is in the doctrine or dogma of a particular faith tradition. Does that keep us from feeling belonging? And what is it that creates that sense of belonging? And as you two were just talking about ritual, I feel as if that is such a place where people can fit into a sense of, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do here, and that almost fosters that sense of belonging. I had a friend once, and you hear many people who leave Catholicism and move towards Protestantism within Christianity, and this woman, she was Presbyterian. And as she grew into adulthood, she became Catholic because she said she felt such a sense of belonging through the rules and the rituals. She said, I knew what I was supposed to do. It was really clear. I knew I was supposed to do this and be here at this time and fulfill these expectations and live in this way. And she said she needed that to feel a sense of belonging. Whereas I think some of that drives people in the other direction, right? So what is it when you step into a tradition or a particular faith community that fosters that sense of belonging?
Yeah, I mean, something I've struggled with during this conversation is Douglas and I, obviously, we have shared our faith, developed our faiths together, but we're not of the same faith. And I think that's good. So there's a level of if you blow it up enough, you say that, it's just one faith. We're all looking for answers about God, and that's my community. That's great. That's what's happening here. But there's something lost. There's something lost. In the same way in which, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. If you broke down all the political parties and you just had one mishmash, there'd be something lost there because there aren't these specific lines of thinking being developed over time. So there's a line somewhere. There's a line somewhere that makes sense as to what defines a faith community. I don't know what it is, but I'm struggling with the idea that pure belonging, open-ended belonging, no matter what you believe, you can be with us, is a coherent definition for a faith. I don't know what you guys think about that.
So say that again.
I said I'm struggling with the idea that a kind of endless open-endedness, that you can have a faith community where it's whatever you believe is okay. You're part of the community. We're answering questions together. I'm struggling with that idea that's coherent, that works. Maybe I'm wrong.
So does the belonging come from the believing? Is that where your struggle is coming from? So like you walking into a Christian church, you're like, okay, well, this is not my set of beliefs. Um, so is the belonging to the Christian community determined by, I mean, I suppose we're talking about community on two levels, belonging to a tradition and feeling belonging in a particular faith community.
And I think there's more to break down there. To draw on a personal example, I grew up in excuse me, in regular attendance at the church we grew up in, every week, going and feeling so strongly a part of that community through all my childhood. Then I went off to college in upstate New York, and I tried attending services at the college chapel that was there, and I bounced off hard. The community was unwelcoming. The community was frankly very hostile to people who were not bought in already to a certain extent. And I dealt with a lot of frustration in that lack of belonging in that specific one, though nominally it was a chapel and a church community of my faith where the shared belief should have helped forge that connection, if not fully forge it. And I remember to this day having a conversation with a peer about how frustrated I was with that process. And they asked, so what was it like at the church that you went to back home? And I started telling them. And not everything was about like the faith practice. It was the people who were there, the people who I knew from growing up, and the people who like I knew I would see again when I went back to visit home. And the way that worship, when shared in that community, felt more meaningful. This idea of, well, I'm not closing my eyes to pray because you just have to, but I'm closing my eyes because we, all of us, are closing our eyes as an act together of prayer. And that's what made it very meaningful to me and meant very little in a community I wasn't attached to. And my friend stopped me and said, I think I get it, because every conversation you've had with me about this college chapel was flat. And suddenly there's this light behind your eyes that is instilling what you're talking about. And I realized, like, yes, there was this passion and connection forged both by what I believed and also the connections that existed within that community. And it's challenging to recognize that a big part of that comes from having already grown up in it. And so some of these connections being ready-made for me. But it was still something that as an adult was very satisfying to reconnect to in a way that should have worked the same way, but didn't with a shared faith in other circumstances. So I think there really is something to a church community that can provide those connections in a way that this general sense of, well, all traditions do have valid connection points, valid beliefs. All of it is a part of how we together understand the divine. There's a specificity to the tradition that you grew up in or that you forge a connection with yourself that anchors you, I think. And Jillian, to connect to that, I see in chat you talked about the organization being valuable, especially as you became a parent to young children, or were already a parent to young children, finding value in that. I'm curious if you can speak to how that organization anchored you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hi.
Hi.
That's good. Hi. I'm in my car, but I'm in my driveway, so I'm not driving. Just to clarify. Okay. Yeah. Well, sort of goes back in time. I think I sort of found. Well, I was born a Catholic. I was baptized and all of that, and then I joined like an Assemblies of God, which is very, a lot of Bible and clapping hands and all that good stuff. And then I moved from Guyana and I moved here, and then it was like a Presbyterian church, then back to Catholic, then back to a Presbyterian. Then the kids started school, and the school was like a Lutheran nursery school, if you will. Anyway, and it was lovely. And for a while there, we had a nice system because that pastor had been there for years, and it was working out really beautifully. And then the kids sort of knew people there, and it was fine. Then there were like 3 pastors within a 3-year span. Like, no kidding. Every year they would change a pastor because nobody would stay. And it became very problematic, and I struggled with it, and it was sad because the kids had sort of grown up in the church and so forth. But I ended up coming to a church closer to my home, and I really needed that structure, and they fellowship a lot, and it kind of got my kids more interested and involved. Because what was happening is, in the last, I would say, year that we stayed in the old church, if you will, there really wasn't a whole lot being organized or put together, and there was a lot less fellowship, and everything was kind of like a little, everything was being sort of done halfway, and it just became problematic. And I still feel a little bit of guilt about it because the people there were lovely, and yeah. However, going back all the way back to your original question, the church that I attend now, that we switched over to, the kids are older now, it's been years, they're very conservative, much more than I am. So, it's a lot of me kind of putting a lot of that aside and kind of going, well, they're good people and I like them a lot, but I mean, their politics and everything, sometimes I think to stay in your church and to kind of go along with it, you got to have some patience and just go, all right, well, you think this way and here's what I'm thinking, So it's something where you just got to kind of find, if you're committed to it, is how I feel. And I don't want to change the church again. And I am pretty happy, and they are good people, don't get me wrong. But sometimes I'm like, whoa, like there's a lot happening here, Yeah, so that's where we are
So
presently.
I'm interested in what you all think about. I think this is a very American, I'm gonna say, thing that happens that in the Protestant circles we call church shopping, which isn't a big part of a lot of other cultures. Like where my family's from in Scotland, you go to the church that is in your village. You don't, and I'm wondering what it is in your practices, the rest of you all, but it's distinctly, I think it's part of American culture, and I think it's part of Protestant American culture that you go places until you feel something that fits right, where you feel that sense of belonging. Whereas in Catholic parishes, that's not so much the case. You go where you live, you go to Mass in the parish where you live, and you just go there. And there's not so much seeking a sense of, is this the community that fits me? So I think it is pretty culturally American Protestant to even ask this question we're asking tonight. Where do you look for that? Where do you find that sense of belonging? But as Douglas has described this situation where he didn't have a choice. He grew up in a family where his grandfather had been the minister, and then ultimately his mother became a minister in this.
Literally grandfathered in, yeah.
Right? You were literally grandfathered in, yeah. So what do you all think about that?
So I think from the way I grew up, and for most Hindus, there's always a prayer room or something set aside in each home where the bulk of your prayers, that's where you perform them. Going to the temple was pretty much just on the big holidays. And I definitely get more out of being in my own space, by myself or with my family, as opposed to going to a place of worship. Not that I don't enjoy that. If I go to church or I go to a mosque or I go to a Hindu temple, I do enjoy it. I think I enjoy the socialization more. But in terms of the spirituality, I think I achieve that more in my own place. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I mean, for me, going to a place of worship is more for sharing with, with a community, whichever community it is, whichever faith tradition, but not so much because I'm going to worship. It's just that I'm going to a place where I will enjoy, friendship and singing and the prayer, but the actual praying part of it, I achieve that better on my own.
Yeah,
And
think
I have
that-
not found a place, sorry, Sanjay,
no,
and
no,
I have
no,
not found a temple, a Hindu temple here in Pennsylvania where I've walked in and said, wow, I'm at home. So, oops,
Same.
go ahead, Sanjay.
Well, I think that's really interesting and true and troubling, honestly. I kind of think of it, it's like a book club. You go and meet the book club and they're reading IQ 84 and you think Murakami's a hack. You're still going to read it. You're not going to quit the book club because it's not about the book. It's about the people. You like it the way they think and you like being in the book club. Reading the book by yourself, you're probably not going to choose a book you don't like. It kind of brings up this idea that maybe the faith community is standing in the way of the faith part. Maybe you're engaging with these belief systems you don't really believe in because, like Douglas said, it kind of feels like home. You like these people and you like their strange conservative beliefs, as Jillian said. And the fact that you're not so sure that you agree with what the pastor's saying isn't getting in the way of filling a fundamental human need to have a community. That's a frightening thought.
I don't think that's quite what I meant, Sanj. Yeah. But when you put it that way, you certainly there's certainly here room for pause to think about what you said. I at work, I'm going to use that's probably where I spend most of my life. There's all faith communities there at work. And we do have some really great discussions. And Meg and I have been talking about faith since you guys were tots. So there's so much alignment in all the faith traditions. I do believe all the fundamental beliefs are the same. And how we choose to worship is what, defines your own faith. Whatever name you call God and whatever rituals you perform. But I do believe there's the same fundamental beliefs in all the religions.
So there's so much study and interfaith studies about what the two of you are talking about right now, about is it multiple paths to the same end?
Yeah.
Or is it multiple paths to different ends? That's a huge field of study in interfaith work. And Sanjay, as you're saying before, it's disturbing to think that we might think everything, or we might seek something where everything is the same, which would feel devastating. There's a reason they're different. There are distinct differences. And we each have belonging to those differences as well. So yes, we might all believe ultimately in some sense of divinity that is greater than us, or we might hold ourselves accountable to some force of creative force or understanding of love and respect and honor and all of that, but there are distinct differences too. And we're not seeking a community here in being an interfaith group. We're not seeking a community where we're all the same. We are upholding one another's values, embracing them, incorporating them even into our own, but appreciating deeply the differences as well.
I think that's a great point, that this is not a faith community. This is almost the opposite. No, well, not the opposite, but the goal here is different. But Jill, did you have your hand up? I don't want to skip over you.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, there are two things that I really like about my pastor. Number one, he's an excellent singer. Like, he's got an excellent voice that I was really drawn to. And he's also, he really knows the scriptures. And I really like that, because I felt, no offense, but here in America, I felt like that was lacking a little bit in many of the churches I went to, where I thought, like, these people, like when I came from Ghana, you know, people really knew scripture back then, and we really studied the Bible and all of that. So some of the conservative parts of him works for me. You know what I mean? Whereas, like, I mean, at other times it can become problematic, of course. But, you know, it's been a 12-year run so far. I also recall something about my late dad, where he would get upset about things at church, and he fell out of church. And I think that sort of led to a lot of his lack of a community as he got older and my kids got older, and dad started to feel a sense of not having purpose anymore. And I'm really aware of that, and I don't want that to happen, that I'm just sort of burning bridges in places where, you know, okay, so I don't like this aspect of it, so then I'm going to walk away from it altogether, you know. So there's that. One last comment. Back to Margaret's comment about, you know, this idea of Catholics and their faith. It's a funny thing, because we always, like, we do these units at work, right? So I'll say to the kids, like, well, do you belong to church, community, you know, do you have a religion, whatever, do you practice anything? No. Well, I'm supposed to be Catholic. Oh, well, would you ever change that? Would you kind of go for something else that might interest you? Oh gosh, no, never. I would never change my religion, but I don't practice it. I have nothing to do with it, but, you know, I'm never going to move away from it, right? So that was an interesting comment there that you made, because it's true. I do see that with Catholics. It's really, you know, I found that in my experience too. Okay, I will be finished for the night.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's especially true among my Jewish friends, many of whom really have no articulable Jewish beliefs at this point, but will never stop identifying themselves as Jewish. It's just as much a cultural signifier. And I don't even think that it's illusory. I think that there is certain Jewish ethics, in the same way there's Christian ethics and there's Hindu ethics, that even if you're totally detached from the religion itself, are kind of baked into you. Someone was raised in that community, you know, so some part of that never leaves you, which might be the basis for the community. I don't know.
I mean, it echoes a sentiment that, well, as a as a person approaching 30 years old who's married, I hear a lot, you know, oh, well, you'll want to go back to a church community when you start having kids. And there's a part of me that I think agrees with that statement. I think that there is something like, there's an element of paying it forward, where you want to instill these long-term traditions that were instilled in you in your child. through the community and through your own actions as a parent. And then there's also the question of like, well, don't tell me what I'm going to believe in just because you think a kid down the road will change my mind. And there's this conflict there of what we might want for the future as a long-term baked in traditional belief and what we want for ourselves as a faith community, in a faith community. Something that I am hearing in a lot of the statements that we're sharing is essentially the appeal of an individual practice that you know is shared, something that you're doing yourself, something that you are believing yourself that you can acknowledge. You can go to a place, acknowledge other people sharing in that, even if their practice differs from you, or even if they have more conservative values than you, or liberal. Whatever values are shared or not shared, there's this sense of, well, these people are in agreement with me that this practice that is actually mine, my private practice, is something that we are going to share together, almost paradoxically. And there's, I think, a challenge in coming into a new one of those later in your life, unless you are really, really focused on a long term. People talk about finding their faith community as they become new parents, as they were children themselves, and as they grow older and begin to think about end of life plans and thoughts. And I think that those transition points and pivotal points are the moments where you really do start thinking about that long-term perspective in terms of what you want to lay down as a belief and practice system. And yeah, Karen, reading your reflection, openness to change within the community, lacking an openness to change can be a real way to bounce off. If you're an older person and you're looking for a new faith community to connect to, and that faith community can't shape itself around what is probably a individual practice that you have come about through a lifetime, it's going to be really hard to connect to a new community. You're going to bounce from place to place and you're going to not settle on the one. You're going to continue to church shop. It's a hard question to answer. I definitely see, well, I see a lot of people here who have found some way to answer it, at least for their individual practices. If it forced people into live stream.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
think it's really expectations in communities, I think are really hard to get past. When communities develop expectations of those who attend, and yet you can't really have a community without there being a certain degree of accountability or expectations in some way. Like in the Presbyterian tradition, there are two foundational documents in the governance of the church. One is called the Book of Confessions and one is called the Book of Order. And in the Book of Order, it is literally the ordering of the expectations and the accountability of the community. And there is a section in the governance of the Presbyterian Church that says, in order to be a member of a Presbyterian faith community, you are committing to holding up all members of the community in mutual concern and in active support. So in order to become a member of the community, you're committing to mutual concern and active support of everybody in that community. So I think that's pretty dramatic. right? That's the expectation of a member of the community, that you're going to uphold, uplift everyone in that community by your actions and your membership in that community. So I think ultimately, when you are a part or you are committing to a community, that's what you're committing to. What is community? Any final thoughts?
I was having a conversation with my dad, and I'm reading what Karen just posted in the chat box, and I think that's the same for a lot of the community, a lot of the different churches and so on. It's, you know, the fighting over, not fighting, it's the discord over, you know, government and the trivial things, you know, and he was saying about not being able to get the new participants, and I was saying, you know, Dad, I think that's true for not only for the Hindu temple but for all the other places of worship. So I think we had posed a question once about how can we get, you know, new people involved in churches and temples and mosques. I think we should explore that some more.
Definitely.
Yep. I mean, you have the older generation who, you know, they're at that part of their life, I guess that phase in their life where they can commit to that, going to being a part of that community on a more regular basis. But somewhere in between, we lose the young folks.
Yeah.
That's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you so much. Any final words from you two?
I know if I could just add to that, I know my girls have expressed to me, their father and I are divorced, and we agreed when we were married to raise the children Catholic. I'm Presbyterian, going back to those sort of roots. And it's my daughters, whether they're attending church with dad or attending church with me, they say that they have difficulty sometimes following what the priest or the minister is saying. And for them, it's really important for them to kind of understand the word and how that relates to them. That's just something they've expressed to me. And each service is a little bit different, and each of them will take a little bit, you know, a little bit of a message from what the minister or the priest had to say. But for them, it was during the church service, being able to connect and understand and kind of keep up with what they're saying.
Thank you. Yeah, speaking again to that, excuse me, difficulty to connect a variety of age levels. I thank you all for being a part of this discussion. It's been a challenging conversation, and I've been very appreciative of all of your inputs. I think that the idea of what makes faith community is a tricky question, especially when counterbalanced with other types of community. It's a hard thing to pin down because it can be so personal and so deeply ingrained when you try to touch back to what it is that roots your belief. But I am personally very grateful for this monthly pocket of conversation and community that we forged together. Thank you all. I'll let Sanjay share his final thoughts as well.
No, this has been a good one. You know it's a good one when I leave and I say, I'm less sure now than I was before.
Yeah.
We've shattered my preconceptions, and next time we're gonna have to build back up some new conceptions for me. So that's our project for the next session.
Yeah.
Okay, Descartes.
I appreciate that. That feels so true. Yeah, to dig deeply. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for leading our discussion, Sanjay and Douglas.
Thank you all so much for allowing us to speak to this together.
Good night, and we hope to have you back again soon. Thank you.